Do we know how many souls communicate, or how souls, not how many, but how souls communicate once out of the body? I guess the question is, do they in fact do that? How are limits placed on the soul once it has left the body? So you've got a soul, it leaves the body. What happens to it? Does it communicate? An extension, I guess, on the one level is people say they see a ghost or a spirit. Is that a soul, or is it different?
Yeah. Well, actually, the ghost, of course, the intrinsic organizing principle for all of that ghost's activities is its soul. Absolutely, no question about it. Now, just to get to your question, there are a lot of studies of near-death experiences which show absolutely that these, well, let's call them spirits or ghosts or souls that have some kind of I'm going to call transphysical embodiment, right? It's not a physical embodiment, but it's a transphysical embodiment. It has a form, right? And of course, those souls, they do communicate with each other, but they don't do so through a larynx. They don't do so through their physical brain. What they are doing is communicating with each other through that spiritual mentative activity that we described as intellect before. So in other words, it's not only possible for this soul to know itself, but it's possible for the soul to communicate itself spiritually through that same spiritual faculty to another soul, another spiritual being that can receive it, not through its ears, right? So it's not hearing with its ears, it's hearing in the spiritual way that we talked about before, and of course it can communicate back. The same thing appears to happen when the soul communicates with the white light, often described as God or Jesus, and also described with deceased relatives and friends. So for all intents and purposes, yes, the souls do communicate with one another, but they don't, and souls communicate with God, but they don't do it so with mouths, and they don't hear with ears, but they do have some kind of spiritual communication capacity and some kind of auditory, we might call it auditory figuratively, some receiving, some spiritual receiving capacity, and of course, those kinds of things. We don't know how that occurs, because the only thing we can understand here on this earth are the physical processes which lead up to those functions, but not the spiritual processes. But believe me, in the beatific vision, we'll know, and that'll be satisfying.
Right.
Second part of your question, are there any restrictions to the soul, right? So are there some restrictions that occur when when the soul is out of its physical body? The answer is yes. It is limited to a particular condition. We won't call it space and time, because space and time are unified continua, right? So space is like a contemporaneous continuum, and time is like a non-contemporaneous continuum, but it's unifying a whole bunch of things. So you actually, space really is a measurement too of position, right? It's not just dimension, but there appears to be some spatial dimensionality and some temporal dimensionality to the manifestation of the soul, which is not configured through physical space and time, through the space-time continuum here on this earth. But there seems to be some restrictive dimensionality. There's certainly a restriction to powers in the soul. You don't get an infinite intellect. You don't get, as it were, an infinite capacity to love in the sense of God's infinite capacity to love. What you do get, though, is a capacity to love that has been purified, but you are loving, excuse me, in your own unique way. You're loving in your own unique brand of lovability, in your own unique personality, right? But you're doing it perfectly, transparently, perfectly purified well. So for all intents and purposes, there are limits to your intellect, there are limits to your love, there are limits to your dimensionality, but everything is brought to perfection within those limits a spiritual perfection within those limits. And that, of course, includes our ability to know and love God. Obviously, we are not going to know and love God as God knows and loves himself, and there's love within the Trinity. However, we will be able to participate in the Trinity. We will be able to know God within the appropriate limits of our intellect, and love God within the appropriate limits of our love in a perfectly purified way that at the end of the day will keep us perfectly joy-filled in the knowledge that we have, the knowledge which is our fulfillment according to the soul we have, and the love which is in accordance with the fulfillment of our capacity for empathy that we have in our restricted soul. So we don't become God, we actually become perfected, spiritually perfected, within the dimensional limits, within the love limits, within the intellectual limits that we have as finite human beings.